The most interesting thing to come from NVIDIA's GeForce 50 series is not the GPUs themselves, not even close, and it's not multi-frame generation either. It's DLSS 4 super resolution upscaling, which has received a substantial update aimed at improving visual quality. The old CNN AI model has been replaced with a newer and larger transformer model, which NVIDIA claims is capable of quality that just wasn't possible with previous versions of DLSS. So how good is DLSS 4 upscaling? Well, let's find out.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Signal RGB, a free application that controls and syncs RGB devices from over 100 brands of hardware, including Corsair, Razer, and Logitech, just to name a few. The user-friendly software offers access to various presets and lighting options via a clean, easy-to-use interface that even provides the ability to replicate your setup in 2D form on screen. We love the uncapped creative freedom, and this is why we not only recommend it, but also use it ourselves and have done so for years. So if you'd also like to try out Signal RGB for yourself, please click the link in the video description.
Deeply investigating upscaling technology is a massive undertaking, so the focus of today's video is DLSS 4 versus DLSS 3 upscaling at a 4K resolution. I've got all the data to look at 1440p and 1080p upscaling as well, but that will be for future videos. The goal is to figure out where DLSS 4 is improved, where DLSS 4 struggles, and the new acceptable minimum quality level for gaming. Previously, we found that for the best experience, you probably wouldn't want to drop below the quality mode at 4K, maybe balanced at a pinch, but when dropping all the way to the performance mode, you'd usually see obvious visual artifacts in motion. Is that also true for DLSS 4, or are those lower settings now more viable? To assess this, I'll be exploring image quality across 14 different areas, including texture quality, edge stability, ghosting, disocclusion, foliage, particles, water, and more. After matching up and comparing footage in all the areas upscaling tends to struggle, we'll have a really solid idea what DLSS 4 modes are visually equivalent to DLSS 3 and how much improvement NVIDIA has been able to deliver. We'll also explore performance briefly, as the new transformer model is larger and harder to run. One thing that I've seen quite a bit of confusion around is DLSS 4 compatibility. DLSS 4 upscaling works on all RTX GPUs right back to the GeForce 20 series. It is not restricted to GeForce 50 series cards. You don't need to buy an RTX 5090 to access DLSS 4 upscaling or ray reconstruction. The only parts of DLSS 4 that are exclusive are single frame generation locked to the 40 and 50 series and multi-frame generation locked to the 50 series. The most useful component of DLSS 4, the upscaling component, is broadly available, which is great to see. All of the visual examples in this video were captured at 4K using a GeForce RTX 5090. I've used a selection of games, all of which had settings such as motion blur, grain, vignette, and chromatic aberration disabled. Sharpening was also set to 0. For the DLSS 3 examples, each game was upgraded to the final version of DLSS 3 upscaling, 3.8.10, using the utility DLSS Swapper. Then for DLSS 4, each game was upgraded to the latest model using NVIDIA's override feature available in the NVIDIA app. This allows us to compare the best version of DLSS 3 with the best version of DLSS 4 in every title. So let's get into it. The most obvious improvement DLSS 4 has made relative to DLSS 3 is in texture quality. Across the last decade, temporal anti-aliasing has been reducing the texture quality and overall clarity of games in an effort to eliminate aliasing. This has created a signature TAA blur that's especially noticeable in motion, and DLSS 3, which is essentially a fancy AI-based TAA that also incorporates upscaling, well, it wasn't immune to this issue. DLSS 4 has made enormous strides in eliminating TAA blur, which has the effect of raising texture quality relative to DLSS 3 and even native TAA. Across all the examples I saw, running games with DLSS 4 gives the appearance that you are using a higher texture quality setting, even though texture settings are completely unchanged in these examples. Another way to look at it is that DLSS 4 makes games look like they are running at a higher resolution because blur is eliminated. At 4K, if say DLSS 4 is delivering a true 4K presentation, DLSS 3 almost looks like 1440p in comparison. As someone that's highly sensitive to detail, this is a game changer in my opinion. In this Cyberpunk 2077 example, both using quality upscaling, not only is DLSS 4 clearly sharper when stationary, it preserves this sharpness when you start to move. When we pause the footage as we're walking forward, it's immediately obvious how much better the texture quality is using DLSS 4, and how some pattern artifacts present in DLSS 3 are reduced or eliminated. And what's super impressive about this is that DLSS 4 on the performance mode has basically the same texture preserving properties, meaning that in terms of texture detail, DLSS 4 performance often looks better than DLSS 3 quality in motion. There are plenty more examples of this. In Ratchet & Clank, looking at these barrels, DLSS 4 is clearly less blurry, and this even applies comparing DLSS 4 performance to DLSS 3 quality. Later in a cutscene, we can see DLSS 4 is again delivering higher texture quality for Ratchet's leather helmet. In Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, we see higher texture quality comparing DLSS 4 performance to DLSS 3 quality for the ground and rocks, and we see both DLSS 4 quality and performance modes delivering a similar texture experience. In most examples, specifically talking about blur and texture quality, DLSS 4 is superior to native rendering, even using the performance mode. Of course, there are other issues comparing performance to native that we'll explore later, but textures in particular are undoubtedly rendered the best using DLSS 4. I even tended to find the experience better using DLSS 4 performance versus DLSS 3 DLAA. The upgrade is so noticeable that I think most gamers will now actually feel like they are experiencing the better than native image quality that DLSS promised way back at the GeForce 20 series launch, because games look, feel, and most importantly play in a way that's less blurry. Another crucial aspect to image quality is edge stability. Not only do we want sharp, clean textures with no blur, but also those textures and edges to look the same between frames, with no sizzling or aliasing. DLSS 4 is generally a significant upgrade over DLSS 3 in this area as well, as you will have been seeing throughout this Horizon Zero Dawn example. Looking at the wooden bridge, DLSS 4 is able to maintain better stability for each line within the texture and geometry, and this even applies when we compare the typically unstable performance mode with DLSS 4 to DLSS 3 quality. In examples like this, even the performance mode provides superior stability to the quality mode previously. Where DLSS 4 sees the largest benefits are when there is a small amount of movement between each frame. In Black Myth Wukong's menu, for example, with DLSS 3 quality mode, the slight swaying in the character causes a bit of instability with fine details and edges. With DLSS 4, even using the performance mode, this new model is much better at identifying edges, accounting for small movements between frames, and locking those edges down to provide much better stability. In some cases like this one, DLSS 4 performance comes out ahead of DLSS 3 quality. This poor stability in motion is generally why we haven't recommended people use the DLSS performance mode previously, even at 4K. In Ratchet & Clank, for example, even though this motion between frames is consistent and relatively slow, DLSS 3 performance is just unable to maintain stability, and this leads to ugly artifacts. Not only is DLSS 4 performance sharper, it's much more stable, which is immediately noticeable in most situations. Now, DLSS 4 performance mode isn't always better than DLSS 3 quality for edge stability. For example, when driving in Cyberpunk 2077, overhead wires and bridges are more stable using the higher render resolution of DLSS 3 quality, though DLSS 4 does have advantages in other areas like fences on the side of the road and overhead lights. But typically speaking, if we compare DLSS 4 quality to DLSS 3 quality, DLSS 4 is the more stable presentation, and I'm yet to come across an example where DLSS 4 edge stability is worse than DLSS 3 when using the same sort of mode. More recent versions of DLSS 3 are not especially prone to ghosting, and I would say across the games I tested that this is rarely an issue, whether we're looking at DLSS 3 or DLSS 4. However, when there is some ghosting, it's hit or miss as to whether DLSS 4 will resolve this problem versus DLSS 3. The Cyberpunk 2077 example we were just looking at is one where DLSS 4 is notably better at reducing ghosting coming off overhead streetlights or the tailpipes on the car. This is another case where DLSS 4 performance can look better than DLSS 3 quality. But when we flick over to Forza Motorsport, a game that is prone to ghosting using most forms of upscaling or even native TAA, there's little change between DLSS 3 and DLSS 4, both using the quality mode. In fact, if anything, I would say ghosting is more visible in this example using DLSS 4, though neither option is particularly acceptable. I also saw that in Ratchet & Clank, DLSS 4 can add ghosting where there previously was none, comparing the same quality settings again. When Ratchet is moving across the red carpet, there is a subtle ghost trail left behind in the DLSS 4 image that is not present using DLSS 3, so that's a disappointing regression in the worst case scenarios. But like I said, I examined 11 games in detail for this video, and I would say most of the time ghosting is not going to be problematic or a concern when enabling DLSS. Disocclusion is up next, and we're primarily going to focus on the artifact you get around your character in a third-person game when moving. Essentially, disocclusion occurs when something on screen moves to reveal the background behind it, and in the frame where this disocclusion occurs, there usually isn't any temporal data to draw from, so it's prone to artifacts. Usually this is seen as a sizzling or lower resolution halo around your character in motion, where the immediate area lacks a bit of definition that you normally see elsewhere on the screen. While DLSS 4 is generally an improvement in texture detail and stability, the technology struggles to deliver an improvement in disocclusion, often creating more artifacts than DLSS 3 when comparing quality mode versus quality mode. This was perhaps the most noticeable in The Last of Us Part 1, where Joel's head moves to reveal the water and grass behind. There's a bit more sizzling in the DLSS 4 image versus DLSS 3 as disocclusion occurs. I suspect this is because DLSS 4 is trying to preserve more detail than DLSS 3, but it has the same single frame of lower resolution data to work with, whereas with DLSS 3, the disocclusion artifacts are hidden somewhat by the overall blurrier image. I also found disocclusion to be slightly worse in Horizon Zero Dawn and Black Myth Wukong in areas where motion was relatively fast and backgrounds were detailed. However, the impact was less pronounced in Dragon Age the Veilguard and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, where really there was little difference between the DLSS 4 and DLSS 3 quality modes. In the best cases, DLSS 4 Balanced Mode delivers a similar experience to DLSS 3 quality mode in this area, but more common I would say the reverse is true, where a lower DLSS 3 mode shows less disocclusion artifacts than a higher DLSS 4 mode. The good news is that a lot of this is nitpicking, and disocclusion artifacts in general are hard to spot at a 4K resolution. To really see the changes, I basically had to step through the footage frame by frame or view zoomed shots in slow motion. In most of these examples, it's difficult to see the difference in real-time, real-world footage, even if there is a small difference when looking closely. The Last of Us was the only game where I found the downgrade noticeable in real time. In most other examples, whenever there are artifacts, they are confined to a small area and disappear within 1 or 2 frames, which is pretty hard to spot. Hair is one of the most difficult elements to upscale due to its dense fine detail. Unfortunately, I didn't see much of an improvement comparing DLSS 3 and DLSS 4 in this area. In games with high quality hair rendering like Dragon Age the Veilguard, there is little difference in the level of detail between the two technologies, and aliasing remains an issue with any level of upscaling, including quality, relative to say, native rendering with TAA or DLAA. I also noticed no difference in Black Myth Wukong, again with upscaling being a reduction in quality compared to native rendering. The challenges with hair rendering also apply to fur, as seen in Ratchet & Clank. While DLSS 4 is able to extract a higher level of detail out of basic textured elements, fur rendering is largely unchanged. It's not a situation where DLSS 4 Balanced is able to match DLSS 3 quality, it's very much a like-for-like comparison. Occasionally, I spotted examples like The Last of Us where hair quality was a bit sharper, but in terms of aliasing, there is little improvement with the new transformer model. Particle reconstruction is another area that can be difficult for upscalers to manage, as particles are often small, fast-moving, and inconsistent. One area that DLSS 4 manages to improve upon DLSS 3 is particle ghosting. In this Starfield example, if you look closely, you'll see some streaky trails following particles in the DLSS 3 image, which are eliminated when using DLSS 4 at the same quality mode. Even if we drop DLSS 4 to the performance mode, ghosting is cleaned up significantly, and this leads to a more stable presentation. This holds true in other games like Ratchet & Clank, which was a bit less prone to ghosting, but still, anytime a particle ghosted in the DLSS 3 image, it was clean in the DLSS 4 image. A further extremely stressful test is looking at airborne spore particles in The Last of Us, and while DLSS 4 doesn't completely eliminate ghosting here, it's noticeably reduced and simply looks better as a result. However, there are still notable differences in particle quality outside of ghosting that limit the advantages of DLSS 4. Upscaled particle quality tends to get worse at lower resolutions like the performance mode, so DLSS 4 performance relative to DLSS 3 quality in most instances gives an edge to DLSS 3 in particle resolution at the expense of ghosting. At the same sort of quality modes, I wouldn't say there is a huge difference in particle resolution and edge quality, but this does depend on the game we're looking at. Generally speaking, I would say that DLSS 4 Bounce mode is on par with DLSS 3 quality mode for particle quality, with the added benefit of less ghosting in the DLSS 4 image. Transparent items are typically pain points for upscalers, and with DLSS 4 I didn't see significant improvements in this area. For the most part, the quality of upscaled transparencies is heavily linked to the render resolution, so these items are more detailed and less pixelated when the DLSS mode is higher. In most scenarios, this means DLSS 4 quality mode is equivalent to DLSS 3 quality mode, as you can see in this Ratchet & Clank example with the circulating hologram. There were some occasions where I saw DLSS 4 balanced able to go toe-to-toe with DLSS 3 quality in transparencies, such as handling this sign in Cyberpunk 2077. But in other areas in Cyberpunk, like with this holographic map, it's more of a parity situation. I did try some matchups with DLSS 4 balanced versus DLSS 3 quality in titles like Dragon Age the Veilguard, but I generally felt that the DLSS 3 quality mode delivered smoother, less aliased transparencies with better reconstruction. The output quality here seems linked more closely to render resolution than upscaling model, whereas the reverse is true for stability and texture detail. The exception to this is when standing still, where DLSS 4 generally has the edge and can produce a more detailed image, similar to what we see with texture quality advantages, but usually this advantage disappears in motion. Fine detail reconstruction is another pain point, where pixel or near pixel level detail can be lost, aliased, or sizzled in motion when the render resolution is too low for the upscaler to handle. This is typically most noticeable on wires and other fine line detail. Generally, like with edge stability, this is an area where DLSS 4 has an advantage over DLSS 3. One thing that was immediately apparent testing games is that DLSS 4 is less likely to show weird patterns in finely detailed grates or meshes, as you can see here in Cyberpunk 2077. This tends to apply even when comparing DLSS 4 performance to DLSS 3 quality, where DLSS 4 shows no major artifacting of this kind. Wire detail, such as overhead power lines, is only marginally improved. Based on testing games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, I would say in this area DLSS 4 balanced is on par with DLSS 3 quality, or alternatively you can get a small improvement to reconstruction at the same mode, such as quality versus quality. However, using these modes is still prone to sizzling and other weird artifacts along the edges of wires in motion, and aliasing can still be a problem. So the best image quality is still with native rendering, like DLSS 3 DLAA, which outperforms DLSS 4 quality mode. For other sorts of fine details, I again found that DLSS 4 balanced gets pretty close to matching DLSS 3 quality, and there are only some occasions where it cannot fully match the reconstruction power of a higher render resolution. Typically these configurations trade blows, and for those who like to stick to quality upscaling, there will be an improvement to this sort of detail, though it won't be as significant as gains to texture detail and general stability. Foliage is extremely important to the visual presentation in most games, so we'll start here by exploring the quality of trees. Generally what I found can be split into two categories. When trees are relatively still, DLSS 4 is a big improvement over DLSS 3, to the point where in some games DLSS 4 performance looks as good or better than DLSS 3 quality. One example of this is The Last of Us Part 1, which benefits from DLSS 4's increase to sharpness and detail. I saw similar outcomes in games like Horizon Zero Dawn, where I felt that DLSS 4 balanced is a good match for DLSS 3 quality. The DLSS 4 image is generally sharper and more stable in motion, though at a lower base render resolution it can struggle a bit with the finest details, so performance isn't always a good match. But then in a title like Indiana Jones, the foliage benefits more from the stability improvements of DLSS 4, and even the performance mode can look less pixelated than the DLSS 3 quality mode in motion. The other category is when motion is faster, like trees blowing in the wind, or when there is lots of fine detail, like tree branches without leaves. In these situations, DLSS 4 versus DLSS 3 quality is more like what we saw when assessing fine detail reconstruction. In Star Wars Outlaws, for example, it's noticeable that DLSS 4 balanced is rendering at a lower resolution than DLSS 4 quality when looking at blowing trees. This is a particularly difficult test for upscaling, and I only really saw quality parity at a similar mode, say quality versus quality. DLSS 4 is a bit more stable and less prone to sizzling, but there were times I would say DLSS 3 does a better job of the dense foliage. In Black Myth Wukong, looking at these fine tree branches, I saw similar to Star Wars Outlaws in that upscaling really struggles to resolve this detail properly, and there can be an advantage for DLSS 3 DLAA versus DLSS 4 quality upscaling. Typically the best match was the same setting, so quality versus quality. The one exception to this is the performance mode, which in both this game and Outlaws was a notable improvement in DLSS 4, probably getting closer to the level of DLSS 3 balanced. The stability of the performance mode is improved, and for this type of foliage, I would say it's now in a usable state, much less ugly reconstruction of these details, even if it can't quite match the output of DLSS quality mode. Though it gets surprisingly close when we put them side by side, testing DLSS 4. I was more impressed with how DLSS 4 handles grass. With DLSS 3, grass could often have a grainy presentation in motion, as there was just too much difference between each frame for the upscaler to handle. This is improved with DLSS 4, as you'll see in this Star Wars Outlaws example. Even putting up DLSS 4 performance against DLSS 3 quality, the DLSS 4 image is less grainy and pixelated, as the grass blows in the wind. And switching from DLSS 4 performance to quality, you get enhanced grass resolution and detail compared to DLSS 3 with less aliasing and better stability. This was also true in games like Indiana Jones, where DLSS 4 performance had more stable and less grainy grass than DLSS 3 quality in some situations, although in this extremely punishing test, some detail is lost using the performance mode with its low render resolution, so in the worst cases you'll still need DLSS 4 quality to match the level of detail. It does depend on the game though. Dragon Age the Veilguard has very fine grass detail, and here I didn't see much improvement from DLSS 3 to DLSS 4, and even some regressions in areas. Generally though, if you're using DLSS 4 performance, it looks like DLSS 3 performance, so you can't match higher quality levels from DLSS 3 through using a lower DLSS 4 mode. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I tended to find DLSS 4 balanced match DLSS 3 quality, with DLSS 4 providing additional sharpness and less blur, as we talked about earlier in this video. Across all the games I tested though, I was quite happy using DLSS 4 balanced or performance when it came to grass upscaling, and this certainly wasn't the case with DLSS 3, where usually the performance mode would be far too grainy and unstable in games with lots of foliage. DLSS 4 does a much better job of reconstructing fences and grates than DLSS 3, giving lower modes an advantage. One of the most noticeable improvements is how DLSS 4 handles repeating patterns without producing moire artifacts, which in examples like this one from The Last of Us gives an advantage to DLSS 4 performance over DLSS 3 quality, despite the much lower render resolution of the performance mode. I saw a similar benefit in Starfield looking at these meshes, where DLSS 4 was much less likely to show an ugly moire artifact in motion. In addition to this, DLSS 4 is typically better at reconstructing superfine mesh detail, say on the pixel level, and it better handles the visibility of items behind fences or grates, which can be blurred or obscured in DLSS 3. Fences are generally more stable and less prone to sizzling as well, especially when comparing DLSS 4 balanced to DLSS 3 quality. The performance mode is a significant improvement as well, with much better clarity and stability reconstructing these items, even if DLSS 4 performance can't always match DLSS 3 quality. Cloth quality benefits from DLSS 4 upscaling, as DLSS 4 is better at preserving texture quality in motion, and cloth elements on characters in particular are often in motion all the time. As we saw from the mesh and fence analysis, DLSS 4 is also better at reducing moire patterns when using upscaling, and one of the bigger issues with DLSS 3 performance mode was constant moire patterns on detailed cloth textures. That is largely eliminated when using the DLSS 4 performance mode, giving it a big quality advantage. In general, I would say to get DLSS 3 quality like cloth, you could use DLSS 4 performance, though sometimes balanced is required depending on the level of detail and the level of motion. In third-person RPGs where your character wears a cape, DLSS 4 is simply the better way to play, as you'll see that cape element on screen a lot of the time and DLSS 4 handles it better. I didn't see much difference in water quality comparing DLSS 3 and 4, generally the same quality modes deliver the same sort of visual experience. In Jedi Survivor, for example, this was definitely the case, and I even saw a regression in visuals comparing DLSS 3 performance to DLSS 4 performance, with DLSS 4 surprisingly being the less stable image. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I saw little difference in water quality. The performance mode in this situation has been upgraded slightly with DLSS 4, but generally it's a wash. Lastly, we have rain. Upscaling tends to struggle here in two ways: rendering the rain particles without aliasing, and preserving detail as rain occludes over the background. When it comes to the rain particles themselves, there's little difference between DLSS 3 and 4. For example, here in Ratchet & Clank, I was only able to match raindrop detail with the same mode, so quality versus quality. When dropping DLSS 4 down to performance, there was a slightly noticeable loss of detail in the rain relative to DLSS 3 quality. As for the stability and quality of the image behind the rain, here in Horizon Zero Dawn I noticed that DLSS 4 Balanced was a close match for DLSS 3 quality. We're actually looking at snow here, but snow is just a type of rain, right? Not super familiar with snow here in Australia, not really a thing here, but anyway, we see about one quality step of improvement provided by DLSS 4. Let's take a look at performance. Now this isn't an in-depth analysis because I simply didn't have the time for that in this video, but we are going to look at how DLSS 4 and DLSS 3 compare on a GeForce RTX 5080. Based on what I saw testing ray reconstruction, I expect the new DLSS 4 transformer model to perform a bit worse on older GeForce 30 series cards, but we'll have to investigate that in a future video. In Starfield at 4K using max settings, using the DLSS 4 upscaling override, cost about a tier of performance. That is to say, the performance we achieved previously using the DLSS 3 quality mode is now only available with the DLSS 4 balance mode. When comparing the quality modes directly, there was an 8% loss to frame rate, although DLSS 4 quality was still good for a 24% performance improvement relative to native TAA rendering, and a 29% improvement relative to DLSS 3 native DLAA. In Dragon Age the Veilguard, we saw similar, testing using the Ultra preset at 4K. Performance dropped by 7% using the DLSS 4 quality mode versus DLSS 3, and this meant a single tier of performance impact across the modes. This means that FSR quality upscaling in comparison moves from being a bit slower than DLSS quality to a bit faster, though obviously with a far different level of image quality. In Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, the upgrade from DLSS 3 to 4 costs about half a tier of performance. DLSS 4 Balanced now performs between the DLSS 3 Balanced and Quality modes, and there's been a 7% hit comparing quality modes. Upscaling is more effective in this title than the previous two, with DLSS 4 quality seeing a 46% higher frame rate than native TAA rendering, and DLSS 4 performance is 79% faster. Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered is another title where DLSS 4 causes one tier of performance loss relative to DLSS 3. Now, DLSS 4 Balanced is pretty similar to DLSS 3 quality frame rates, and again there's about a 7% impact to frame rate comparing quality modes. In the area we tested, DLSS 4 performance was good for a 39% improvement to FPS compared to native TAA rendering. Black Myth Wukong, tested using the very high preset without path tracing, was a title where DLSS 4 cost half a tier of performance. DLSS 4 Balanced sits right between DLSS 3 Quality and Balanced. There was a 6% impact to frame rate moving from DLSS 3 to DLSS 4 in this title, and the performance mode is able to nearly double the frame rate compared to native rendering. Lastly, we have Cyberpunk 2077. Here I experienced the least performance impact, just a 5% drop to frame rate comparing DLSS 4 and DLSS 3 quality modes. In this game, each tier is still quite comparable, and this could be due to the lower overall frame rates from running at 4K using the Ultra Ray Tracing preset. Here is the geo-mean average of all 6 titles, and what we typically see from DLSS 4 versus DLSS 3 is a half tier of performance impact. That is to say, DLSS 4 Balanced now sits between DLSS 3 Quality and Balanced for FPS improvement, and DLSS 4 Performance now sits between DLSS 3, Balanced and Performance. The typical performance impact was 7% comparing each of the modes directly. However, switching over from DLSS 3 Quality mode to DLSS 4 Performance mode improved performance by 14% on average. Overall, DLSS 4 Super Resolution Upscaling is a very impressive improvement for 4K gaming. NVIDIA has been able to deliver noticeably higher image quality at each DLSS tier in the majority of scenarios we tested for, which now makes lower modes, like the DLSS Performance mode, genuinely viable at this resolution without distracting and ugly artifacts. I was blown away with how NVIDIA has been able to fix TAA blur with DLSS 4, leading to a clearer, sharper presentation with higher quality textures. TAA has always had this signature loss of clarity and motion, but even with DLSS 4 on the performance mode, this is basically eliminated entirely. The outcome is that games with DLSS 4 enabled appear to have the sharpness we normally associate with running at a higher resolution, and the texture quality and detail associated with higher quality texture packs. As an analogy, if DLSS 4 represents 4K gaming with ultra textures, DLSS 3, the old version, is more like 1440p gaming with high textures in comparison. I think anyone using DLSS 4 for the first time would immediately notice its superior clarity, And while for some this may be more of a subconscious improvement, I think basically everyone will prefer the DLSS 4 experience. I was also very impressed with how DLSS 4 is able to clean up some pain points of upscaling, particularly using lower modes. DLSS 4 is much more stable in motion, a sizable increase comparing performance modes, and it's less prone to annoying moire artifacts. Grass is typically more stable and less grainy in motion, fine detail reconstruction is improved, particularly for fences and grates, and particle ghosting is less likely to occur. Not every aspect has improved though. Hair and water rendering is largely unchanged compared to DLSS 3, and there's a regression in some forms of disocclusion, though this is hard to spot in real-world gaming scenarios. It's also possible that in scenes with heavy ghosting using DLSS 3, that this ghosting will actually be worse using DLSS 4, though in general, most scenes show no ghosting or even improved ghosting with DLSS 4. Assessing all areas of visual quality, I believe that for 4K gaming, DLSS 4 is providing 1 to 2 tiers of visual improvement. This means the experience you used to get with the DLSS 3 quality mode is now achievable using DLSS 4 performance, or in more tricky scenarios, maybe DLSS 4 balanced. Previously, I couldn't recommend the DLSS performance mode for 4K gaming due to its instability. Now, I'm happy to recommend the performance mode, and across many hours of gaming, I was really happy with the image quality this mode provides. Naturally, image quality does improve further if you use DLSS balanced, DLSS quality, or even native DLAA modes, particularly for fine detail reconstruction. But DLSS 4 performance is very much good enough for everyday gaming without being distracted by horrible artifacts and instability. Now, DLSS 4 is a heavier algorithm than DLSS 3, so there is a performance cost associated with using it. On an RTX 5080, this was about a 7% FPS loss at the same quality mode, or about half a tier of impact. So the overall improvement from DLSS 4 is about 1.5 tiers of quality improvement at half a tier of performance loss, which levels out to about a 1-tier improvement. You can think of this like the new version of DLSS providing the visuals of the quality mode at the performance uplift of the balanced mode. Another way to think of this is that Nvidia have basically delivered a 15% gain or thereabouts via a software update, at least for more recent GPUs. That may not sound like a whopping improvement at first, but it's pretty massive just from software. It's actually more of a gain than Nvidia provided in hardware, going from the RTX 4080 Super to the RTX 5080, and it's also more of a gain than we saw from the Windows 24H2 update versus Windows 23H2 for Ryzen CPUs, which we described as a mega gain with around that 10% improvement. Pushing out a driver/software update that allows gamers to either get better visual quality in their favorite games or a performance boost at a similar visual level is excellent work from Nvidia. The fact Nvidia spent all this time talking about multi-frame generation instead of DLSS 4 upscaling improvements is kind of mind-blowing to me. Yeah, I get that multi-frame gen is trying to sell you on a new shiny GeForce 50 series GPU, but DLSS 4 upscaling is much more impressive, and it was talked about just a fraction of what we saw with multi-frame gen. Imagine instead of trying to claim an RTX 5070 as an RTX 4090, that Nvidia talked up how they practically solved TAA blur with DLSS 4, and that this benefit is coming to all RTX GPU owners. I'd be much more likely to keep buying an Nvidia GPU if I knew I was being supported and looked after with quality improving, broadly useful software updates over time, like we're seeing with DLSS 4 upscaling. So where does this leave AMD and their FSR technology? Well, I don't want to dive too much into this because we'll be seeing FSR 4 in just a few weeks, and you can be sure we'll do a deep dive into that tech when it's released. But as things stand right now, FSR 3.1 and especially FSR 2.2 upscaling is not at all competitive with DLSS 4. It's common for DLSS 4 performance mode upscaling to look much better than FSR 3.1 quality upscaling, and typically DLSS 4 performance is 15 to 20% faster too. So FSR 4 needs to be enormously better than FSR 3.1, and I don't think matching DLSS 3 will cut it. That will just maintain the usual generational divide we've seen between DLSS and FSR for years now. They need to get much closer to DLSS 4 with this update. On top of this, AMD is in real trouble if they can't get FSR 4 into a large number of games quickly. NVIDIA laid the groundwork years ago for driver-level DLSS upgrades by using a DLL that can be intercepted and upgraded on the fly, either in the NVIDIA app or by third-party tools, meaning that the vast majority of DLSS games can be easily upgraded to DLSS 4. AMD, on the other hand, only started using DLLs with FSR 3.1. There are so many games where a user could realistically upgrade to DLSS 4 on an NVIDIA GPU, but maybe they'll be stuck with FSR 2.2 upscaling on an AMD GPU. In those games, NVIDIA will be providing a decisively better quality experience, so how AMD responds to that is going to be very interesting to say the least. Of course, I have actually seen FSR 4 in person at CES, and based on what I've seen, it's a decent upgrade over FSR 3.1. Will that be enough to match DLSS 4? I'm not sure. That will take a deep analysis. What I do know for sure is that right now, DLSS 4 upscaling is the best way to play games. It's a big improvement over DLSS 3, and I can't wait to see what it can do at lower and more common resolutions like 1440p. For now though, that's it for this in-depth and lengthy investigation into DLSS 4 upscaling at 4K. As you can imagine, these sorts of videos take an incredibly long amount of time to put together, so we always appreciate the support of our Patreon members that make these sorts of videos possible. If you want to support us directly in the work that we do, please consider supporting us via Patreon. It really helps us out, and you'll gain some cool benefits in return, like access to our Discord chat and monthly live streams. But anyway, until we get to testing DLSS 4 at 1440p and 1080p and also start the comparisons to FSR 4, that'll do it for this one. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.